Okay, so criticisms, one-off, it's long, it's a thing. So first and foremost, what is a criticism? Criticisms are positions in debate that are based entirely out of critical theory, which is a philosophical and political field that looks at systems, usually systems of oppression, in order to indict them. Specifically, what you're looking at is your various paradigms or the methodology that informs the way we're acting. In general, you see criticisms run most frequently in debate on the opposition, though critical affirmatives have also become a thing. They're a little bit harder to run because you need something to argue against and indict, and that leaves you with indicting the resolution, which becomes tricky when you're supposed to uphold it at the same time. So you see them more frequently on the opposition, indicting the paradigm that the plan is functioning in. So when a criticism is run, you ask the judge to vote on the methodology of the plan rather than on what the plan actually does. So an easy way to look at why critical theory is important is to look at an action and ask whether or not it comes from a system that you disagree with. For example, if I were to say, what your action is really great. For example, if you were to compliment someone's appearance, but the way you said it was, damn, girl's a sexy bitch, I'm still going to call you a sexist, even though what you said was in theory nice. So you can do the same thing with policy decisions, where I can say, yes, technically you're giving money back to the poor, but the way you're doing it is through increasing taxes that are actually going to subvert social systems, and that's going to make their situation worse. So you can look at the paradigm of systematized oppression that's causing these problems to become cyclic. And if you indict that paradigm, then whatever action you're trying to put a Band-Aid over it becomes irrelevant. You can think of the way that they function in relation to the case essentially as a disadvantage or as a case turn, even though it's a position that's going to take up usually the entirety of the opposition. It's a case turn insofar as sometimes you'll make a solvency turn where you say, because your action comes from a capitalist paradigm, you cannot solve back for these systems of oppression. That would be a solvency turn style of a criticism. Or you can just have it as a disadvantage where you say, whatever your action is, it supports a system of sexism. Sexism has so many larger impacts than whatever the impact of your case is, and therefore the disadvantage that the criticism functions as outweighs your case. So just a couple notes on vocabulary. Two of the main things, and these are both framework points. One is fiat. Fiat is used in every round that's policy or critical or otherwise, but it becomes something that's often debated when the round is critical. So fiat is an educational it's an educational tool in which we create a hypothetical world. In debate, that's the world of the plan, where we imagine this plan has taken place. What does that world look like? And is that world better than the status quo? Fiat's useful because it allows us to engage whether or not plan was a good idea in order to decide whether to do it in the real world. In critical theory, you hear an argument often that says fiat is illusory because at the end of the day, we aren't the United States federal government, we aren't actually in Syria, and we aren't actually technically changing anything by discussing these ideas. What critical debaters will do is encourage us to realize that the paradigms that our arguments come from are real in a way that leaves with us at the end of the round. Especially within theoretical debate, we often talk about education. Critical debaters are talking about the same thing when they're saying we are educating ourselves on paradigms of statism, on paradigms of capitalism, or paradigms of sexism, and those leave with us even though the United States didn't actually invade Syria during this round. So if I can demonstrate that the education coming out of this, that the paradigms we're learning and taking home with us are bad, that's an impact that's real and comes away with us and should outweigh anything that's happening in the fiat world. The other argument, which is very similar, that you hear a lot, is the delineation between methodology and ontology. Methodology, as it's used in critical debate, is the paradigm that is informing the actions that we take and the worldview. This is both the actions of the plan, such as capitalist actions via taxation, etc., but it's also the words that we use, or I'm sorry, that's ontology. It's really early. Methodology is the paradigm that informs our actions and informs our worldview, such as capitalism or sexism. It's the place that those actions are coming from. Ontology is what the actual actions are. So it's when you actually have a plan, what your plan is actually doing, And in the case of a discursive criticism, it's the words you use to phrase that action. Does that make sense? Yes, okay. So there are a lot of different styles of criticism, and these can be run both on the affirmative and on the negative. The first delineation is a discursive versus an action-based criticism. Discursive criticisms question the rhetorical paradigms that are used within the round, as in whatever your action was fine, but the way you phrased it wasn't. Your phrasing was sexist, your phrasing was racist. So you'll see that a lot in criticisms such as monolinguism, which questions the language you use and your failure to engage in multiple languages as being exclusive within the round. You'll also see it with criticisms like First Peoples, which say if you use the phrase Native Americans or if you use the word Indians, it's incredibly offensive, and therefore even if you're re-enfranchising those peoples, your action is still re-systematizing oppression. You also see action-based criticisms, which are questioning the actual action and the paradigm that belies the action taking place. So that would be questioning things such as securitization, things such as capitalism. Because the action itself is seated in a system that is bad, the action itself is bad, regardless of how you phrased it. The next delineation is between pre-fiat and post-fiat criticisms, and that's simply asking where the criticism functions, and it's really relevant in terms of where the criticism functions in relation to the plan. Pre-fiat are criticisms that have impacts that take place a priori to the fiat world, so it doesn't matter whatever happens in the world of fiat. The harms of the criticism have already taken place without an engagement of fiat ever happening. Discursive criticisms are maybe the easiest example of this because the words we use happened in the round, and I can always indict you for the sexism of your words or the fact that you use the word Indians instead of First Peoples, and it doesn't require an engagement of fiat or the plan to ever have taken place for me to make that indictment. Post-fiat criticisms are criticisms in which the alternative of the criticism and the criticism itself does require an engagement of fiat. The most immediate example of that would be DDEV-style criticisms, where their alternative is going to say something like, destroy capitalism by collapsing a global market and move towards bioregionalism, which still functions in a world of post-fiat in a very plan-like fashion in order to elucidate a way in which we can tear down the system that's being indicted by the criticism. The next one is asking how the round is going to be weighed. Framework debate becomes really important in criticisms because you're asking people to weigh things in a way that's different than what you're going to look for on a policy style. Because criticisms are usually concerning things like oppression, they're going to tell you that the actual policy actions need to come after a question of the morality of what the plan is. So you can see a lot of criticisms coming from a place of morality or non-policy, and they're going to ask you to weigh the round in terms of something like value to life instead of something like net benefits. They're going to say that every life is infinitely valuable, and having things as a body count is only another form of oppression. It's another form of turning people into numbers, and that only systematizes violence. There are criticisms that can still function within net benefits. A lot of criticisms that are post-fiat will still function within a net beneficial world, and a lot of criticisms can function in both. For example, a DDEV criticism can claim that by destroying capitalism, we'll create a better world that will be net beneficial for whoever makes it through the transition. But even if that weren't true, it's still morally imperative that we deconstruct capitalism because it creates systematized violence in the status quo. One last type of criticism that is a little bit different is a performative criticism. These ones roughly function pre-fiat, but you can also have post-fiat performative criticisms. And they use a performance or a performative style of argument in order to elucidate the thesis of the criticism. These are usually your narrative case, such as a rape narrative or a natives narrative or a poetry criticism, and their own specific style. Yeah. Are there any questions on the different types? Okay. So the parts of the criticism, it is full position, so it has a parts just like any sort of a disadvantage would. The one part that is pretty different is a criticism is usually going to start with a thesis. The thesis sets up what the overarching methodology that you're indicting is in the course of your criticism. So if we were to take capitalism as an example of a criticism, they're going to tell you all the reasons why capitalism is problematic. They're going to make arguments like capitalism reduces people to cogs in a machine, it turns you into a number, and your life becomes expendable in the name of profit, and all of those things are grossly immoral. So it just gives you an overarching reason. It's very analogous to the harms that would be put on a disadvantage. The next section of the criticism is the framework. It sets up which type of criticism is being run as per the types of criticism from the previous slide. So whether it's functioning in a pre-fiat round, wherein you're going to make arguments like fiat is illusory, or whether it's functioning in a post-fiat round, in which case the weighing paradigm that's used is probably going to be the most important part of your framework. The weighing part comes where you're telling the judge how the round should be voted upon. This includes both saying whether you're functioning on value to life versus net benefits, or if you have a different weighing paradigm, those are the two most common ones. What the role of the ballot is, whether the ballot is going to create an ongoing movement, whether the ballot is simply an affirmation of the judge with regards to the methodology in the round, whatever that role may be. It also often is used to delineate what access the other team has to different arguments. So you can get up and you'll delineate a framework and say, these are the disadvantages to the criticism that the other team would have access to. Anything that is outside of perhaps a value to life framework is not a responsive disadvantage to the criticism and should be viewed as irrelevant. And and then it also delineates whether or not it should be valued a priori. The next section is the links, which, just like any sort of a link argument, explains how the other team has supported the paradigm that is being indicted. There's usually several of them, and just the next lecture is on how to respond to Ks. Just as a word of advice, almost never try to argue the links. It is a waste of your time, because almost always the criticism is going to link to whatever the plan is. Links are a little bit different in the case of an affirmative criticism, because what you're linking to is the resolution. So either you're indicting the resolution, in which case you have a whole bunch of reasons why you don't need to uphold it, or you're extrapolating off of the resolution some larger system that you're indicting. But in general, what you're going to see with the link is if my plan is the United States federal government will reduce taxes for people within below the poverty line, or will increase taxes for people below the poverty line in order to fund social programs. My link to capitalism would be you engage taxes, which is an economic structure. Economic structures in the modern world support capitalism. The next section is your impacts, which is simply the connotations of your methodology. It's the same as the impacts that you would have on a disadvantage, where you're just extrapolating out what the larger system is going to cause. A lot of times the impacts to a criticism are far more similar to the harms than perhaps the impacts you would hear on something like a disadvantage, because you're usually talking about a system that already exists in the status quo, and simply saying that the plan supports that system in the same way that you would have a linear disadvantage. But a lot of times what you see with the impacts and the way you get away with having a linear style of impact is you end up claiming that the criticism or the paradigm that's being indicted is the root of larger systems of violence, and that by supporting those things, you're supporting the same violence that belies the impacts of the case. For example, if I claim that your case is otherizing and I prove that otherization is the internal link to violence and war, then even if you have a nuclear war scenario, because my criticism talks about the root cause of all violence, it will still outweigh even though it's linear. The last part of the criticism is the alternative. The alternative is analogous to the plan on a affirmative case, and it gives an alternate textual advocacy that competes with the plan in order to resolve the harms of the criticism, or at least in order to improve upon whatever the plan has supported. There's several different styles of alternatives, which I'll talk about in just 1 second. Any questions on parts of the K? Cool. So in terms of the framework debate, just to explain it a little bit further, and the specific types of arguments that you would have, The first question is always what type of criticism is it going to be, whether it's going to be pre-fiat or post-fiat, and again, that's where you're going to see your fiat is illusory arguments happening, as well as whether it's discursive or action-based. That delineation also occurs again when you reach the alternative, simply whether the alternative is going to relate to the way things are phrased or a different action that can be taken. But within the framework, you can make arguments regarding whether your actions are more important than your words, or whether the rhetoric we use comes before the actions taking place. The framework of a criticism is mostly about ordering. It's about saying which arguments need to be held first. This is also where you see the argument of methodology before ontology, which is just to say that we need to question the way in which we are going about something before we go about it. If we go about something in a bad fashion, it's worse than if we never went about it at all. Then you need to argue about how the round will be weighed, whether it will be policy based or whether it will have a value to life sort of a paradigm, as well as what the role of the ballot will be, as well as when the arguments are going to be weighed. If it's a priori, those are usually your pre-fiat cases, or whether it'll be weighed in line with case, such as your post-fiat criticisms like DDEV and things such as that. And then again, you also look at what arguments the other team is going to have access to, specifically in terms of what parts of plan do they still retain access to. Some criticisms allow you to still weigh the full impacts of your plan against the criticisms. Other criticisms are going to say that you no longer have access to them because they don't function within the framework of the K. Okay, so the alternative to the criticism offers an alternative textual advocacy that responds to the harms of the methodology being questioned. There's several different types, but the largest is the rejection versus, the reject alternative versus a constructive alternative. A reject alternative simply asks for a rejection of whatever the methodology was that was in the plan, and also a rejection of the team that supported it. So an example of that would be vote neg to reject all instances of capitalism in all of its forms. Reject alternatives are very much reject the team and the argument style, and they claim that there is no requirement to offer an alternative, and that rejection raises awareness, and that will have solvency into and unto itself. Because they're making arguments such as methodology before ontology, we need to have a system of questioning the paradigms that exist before we can offer solutions to them. Because the rejection is questioning the systems that exist, it is still creating solvency in a world where we're only looking for a questioning of methodology and not necessarily a resolution of the harms. Constructive alternatives do offer action-based advocacies, and they often come in the form of reject plus. So building off of the capitalism example, it would be something along the lines of reject all instances of capitalism by transitioning into bioregionalism. DDEV is also a similar example where in the case of a capitalist DDEV case, you would say the United States federal government will deliberately inflate its currency in order to collapse Wall Street. And this will lead to a global collapse of the market, and that will transition into a non-capitalist society once capitalism is gone. So something like that, where it does have an actual action to take place. Constructive alternatives thus have a bit more leverage on alternative solvency debates to claim how they're actually getting transparent solvency on the harms of the alternative. Reject alternatives, like I said, need to leverage a lot that questioning is solvency into itself. Alternate solvency on critical rounds also has several different levels to it, depending on whether the criticism is pre-fiat or post-fiat. So you can have in-round solvency where if my only goal is to convince the judge that sexism is wrong, and I say that the role of the ballot is a representation or an affirmation of rejecting sexism in all its instances, then if the judge signs the ballot in my favor, that's in-round solvency for the goal of the alternative. You can also have a larger version of that, which would be outside of the round solvency. A lot of times those are your criticisms that have alternatives that are stylized as movements, where they're going to say that by taking education out of this round and educating us on this movement, it will proliferate into the larger community, and the community as a whole will reject capitalism in the future. You can also look at some alternatives such as, I think at Nationals 2 years ago, it was vote neg to like such and such Facebook page, which was about anti-oppression in some certain community. And so they would construct a larger movement, and the alternative would call you to join that movement. You can also have alternative solvency that is post-fiat, and those are in your post-fiat rounds, and that would be discussions of why DDEV is going to result in a more utopian world, why bioregionalism is going to be better than capitalism, or things such as that. And then you're weighing those usually against the impacts of the actual case. The last part of constructing an alternative is, in general, giving a whole list of perm preempts, because it's one of the primary ways about going on responding to the criticism. So you'll hear a lot of arguments specifically that any form of the plan is still going to link to the criticism, and any link to the criticism still gives you the full leverage of all of your impacts, is the primary answer that you're going to hear on perms, and therefore it's impossible for you to do any construction of permuting the alternative with the plan without cutting all of the alternative solvency. Does that make sense? The slide got deleted, which is really unfortunate. But I did want to talk really briefly about how the criticisms relate to the case. This is mostly important in learning how to respond to a criticism, but it's also relevant to quickly talk about here. Criticisms relate to the case in terms of disadvantages or case turns, and it's important to understand them in that way so that you know which arguments to look for when you're hearing responses. Understanding which part of the case a criticism is turning, such as if your criticism is functionally a solvency turn, which is pretty common, such as because your plan supports a larger system of capitalism, or your plan supports larger systems of oppression, it can never re-enfranchise the public, it can never solve any aspect of those oppression because it is the root cause thereof, is a solvency turn style of argument. And so you're going to put a lot of focus on root cause sorts of debates. Alternatively, if it's just a larger disadvantage to the impacts of the case, you're just going to do impact calculus and argue that no matter what the impact of the case is, the impact of the criticism will always outweigh it. So just as a stylistic thing. So there are also critical affirmatives. I wasn't going to cover them in a whole lot of depth here, but critical affirmatives are functionally exactly the same as a critical opposition, except for you're indicting a methodology that is either within the status quo or that is within the resolution. So it's really common to hear a resolution such as the one we heard yesterday: the United States federal government will boycott the Olympics because of Russia's anti-gay stance. Would have been a really good resolution to run a queer theory critical affirmative in which you talk about how rejecting and silencing the voices of the LGBTQ community leads to systematized oppression. Systematized oppression is the key to otherization, which is the key to all violence. It's easy to support that resolution because the resolution is calling you to indict anti-gay methodologies, and so that would be a case in which you're still upholding the resolution while able to run a critical affirmative. In other cases, such as what's a good example? The United States federal government will subsidize sustainable agriculture and green technologies. You could say that the United States federal government will never be able to do that because capitalism is always going to undermine a transition into green technology, and capitalism is a larger and worse system. And so you could reject the resolution in its entirety and run a capitalism criticism on the affirmative, but it would require the creation of a block that explains why you no longer need to uphold the resolution, and it's still a valid choice on the affirmative. The way those arguments are usually going to look is you're going to see arguments such as the resolution is a call to question a topic and not necessarily a call to affirm it, and just deconstructing whether or not prima facie you have to uphold the resolution in an affirmative way when you're on the government team. In the case of a critical affirmative, what you're going to have instead of an alternative is just your plan text, and it can be pre-fiat, it can be post-fiat. Most frequently, critical affirmatives will happen in a post-fiat fashion, such as in the case of the anti-gay laws in Russia and boycotting the Olympics. You would have probably seen an affirmative critical plans such as the United States federal government will boycott the Olympics as a symbol of solidarity with the LGBT community in a global sense, or something like that, and then you'll run all of your critical advantages off of it. On any plan, you can always run critical advantages, whether your plan itself is critical or whether your negative or your op is into and unto itself critical. It can be a really advantageous way to go because you get leverage into some of these systematized impacts such as root of violence impacts, otherization impacts, which are very effective when you're trying to compare it to things such as nuclear war. A lot of dehumanization impacts are just miniature criticisms into themselves when you're arguing that we need to value that person's life or we need to value the way in which systemic poverty is created. You're able to leverage that still working within a framework of net benefits and still working within whatever type of plan you want to run. So are there any questions on any of those things? No? Okay. Sorry, my lecture is a little frazzled. I'm really tired. So for the rest of the time, I wanted to just go through some examples of criticisms to construct. Let's go back to, yeah.
Are you going to put this on Dropbox?
Yes, I'll do that. Okay, so let's do, I think that capitalism is one of the easiest criticisms to first read and understand, partially because it sounds a whole lot just like regular policy style impacts. So let's start with that one as an example. So okay, so if we wanted to run a capitalism criticism against the plan, the United States federal government will subsidize healthcare for populations below the poverty line. Starting with the thesis, can anyone tell me what the thesis of a capitalist critique is, or an example of what one could be? So the thesis of a criticism is just trying to give you an overarching reason of the harms that are being created by this paradigm. So all of us know reasons why capitalism is really messed up and creates systemic poverty. But the most common thesis that you're going to hear on a capitalist critique is, one, it reduces people to cognitive machine, lives, lives are expendable in the name of profit.
When people are commoditized, we want.
Cool. And that's the general gist. The most important part of a thesis like this that you're going to go for is this line, that lives are expendable in the name of profit, and that there is no value to life. There are alternate versions of it. You can do an over-consumerist capitalism critique, for example, wherein people's lives become driven only by what they consume, and that undermines their value to life. But for the purpose of this one, let's go with this thesis. So is this thesis, do we want to do a pre-fiat or a post-fiat criticism for capitalism? What was that?
Post-fiat.
Post-fiat. Excellent. What's the first argument you make under the framework? Post-fiat. Does a fiat illusory argument matter? No. A lot of criticisms are going to make it anyways, actually mostly just as a time-suck argument. But if you're arguing from a post-fiat sense, you don't need to argue that fiat is illusory, but you do still need to argue that methodology comes before ontology. And that's probably going to be the first point that you put under your framework. Because this is going to give you access into why the criticism is going to matter a priori to any impacts of the case. It's strategic to do that even in the case of a post-fiat criticism because it gives an additional level of importance to the impacts of your criticism over the impacts of plan. Because even in a world in which you can demonstrate that whatever the advantage of your plan is in the same line of whatever the impact of my thesis is, if methodology comes before ontology, the fact that my alternative creates an indictment and a questioning process of the paradigm of capitalism means I'm gaining an additional advantage that the plan can never access because it doesn't question methodology. So what's the next point under a framework in a post-fiat criticism like this? What's your weighing mechanism?
Value to life?
You can do value to life. You can, in a case like this, you can do value to life or you can do net benefits. And part of that will be a question of what your alternative is going to look like. But sure, let's do value to life. So what are some reasons why a value to life standard is good or perhaps why a net benefit standard is bad? So what is a net benefit standard for weighing?
Greatest amount of good.
Greatest amount of people.
Greatest number for the greatest number. So why might that be a problematic way of weighing around?
Still marginalizing a few.
Yeah. So having a weighing paradigm like net benefits is highly marginalizing because it says there is no implicit value to a given life. A given life is always expendable so long as more lives are saved by that expense. Which brings us back to something very similar to this, that lives are expendable in the name of profit. When you're maximizing profit, capitalism can look like a very utilitarian system. Something like this can seem very utilitarian, and it can seem like it's reducing poverty. But because you're functioning in a system that still marginalizes, or in a net beneficial way, if the population at the lowest end of the poverty line is still viewed as expendable under this plan, even though rising waters raise all boats and some people might benefit from it, the fact that those people are still marginalized means the plan isn't good enough at all. So going with a value to life standard on this gives you leverage into those arguments. So a value to life argument would go something along the lines of, every life is infinitely valuable. Net benefits are bad because they reduce and dehumanize the individual into an expendable number. In the name of a larger good. And essentially making the argument that that life is never expendable. You see this sort of argument happen all the time in fields like distributive justice, when they are asking about things like how do we reduce poverty, and specifically when we're looking at how do we reduce poverty in things like healthcare? Do we invest all of our money in the poorest populations, which are the sickest, and then only help maybe 5% of the population, but help them a whole lot because they're the worst off? Or do we use the same amount of money and invest it in 50% of the population and get them up to the same level, standard of health that you would have gotten that 5% to about only investing in them because they're starting off healthier? So essentially, do you sacrifice the ones who are going to take way more resources than you could possibly have in order to save more people? Or is that still not defensible because it doesn't value the fact that each person's life is intrinsically and irreducibly valuable? Whenever you're deciding on your weighing paradigm, it's important to look at the specific harm of your criticism and how it's functioning in relation to their plan. So if you want to go for something like, even if you're improving this because you justify these lives being lost, you still have an immoral plan text. That tells you that you're probably going to want to go along with something like a value to life standard. If all you're looking for is capitalism creates systemic poverty for more people than this plan is ever going to solve for, then you can go along with a net beneficial paradigm because you're still playing a numbers game. So that's a stylistic choice. Does that delineation make sense? Cool. So going along with the value to life paradigm, every life is infinitely valuable. Net benefits are bad because they reduce and dehumanize the individual life into an expendable number in the name of a larger good. And another argument that you should throw out there is net benefits are bad because they encourage race to the bottom, impact calculus, which negates the implicit value of life. That's how you would, in general, set up a value to life standard. So after the framework, next section is the links. What are some examples of links that you would have from this criticism to this plan? So a link would be something like, so you just need to give me a reason why this plan supports capitalism in some sense, any sense of the word. It can even be vague. I would probably do something along the lines of subsidies are capitalist. It's probably good enough, right? Subsidies are a subset of capitalism. And if you wanted to expand that argument out, you would say, you could even make specific arguments as to how subsidies lead to poverty, which is an easy easy argument to make, right? You can look at subsidies in agricultural markets leading to systemic poverty in rural agricultural groups. You also make the argument that the money of the state owns the health of the individual. So this plan implicitly commodifies health because it commodifies healthcare and says that healthcare is something that you need to buy, that your life is something you need to be able to afford to live. The state owning the healthcare system and justifying that the state should retain ownership of the healthcare system would be another link that you can have. It's a particularly good one if you're trying to go for something such as the value to life, because the commodification of life implicitly negates its value because it's something you have to buy and not something you have a right to. But so after the links, you'd have impacts. Impacts would just be an extension of these harms. So explaining why it's bad that lives are expendable at the name of profit. Can anybody give me a couple arguments as to why that might be true? Like, what is the end result of why capitalism is bad? If you were even just going to run it in a policy style, what are some cap bad arguments?
Extinction via over consuming of resources.
Mm-hmm.
Poverty becomes
Capitalism leads to overconsumption. You can make that line out to extinction. In the case of this specific criticism, this argument can be a little bit difficult if you want to function within a value to life framework, because this argument is very numbers based. An argument that you might want to go for is extending why it's problematic for lives to be expendable, and perhaps what that means in terms of dehumanization or otherization. So, lives are expendable means there's no value to life. Means that your life is not worth living. And then you extend all the reasons why you had a value to life standard to begin with. If you can get back to that place in your impacts, you've already done a lot of that work for yourself. But you can also extend that just in general. Why is it bad for people not to have a value of life? We make dehumanization arguments all the time. Why is dehumanization bad? You can even make an extrapolation of root cause arguments there. You can also make the argument that capitalism is the root of all poverty. You couldn't be poor before money existed for you not to have it. So if capitalism is the root of all poverty, then any impact of your plan in the reduction of poverty or the improvement of quality of life becomes completely irrelevant, because you are the root cause of poverty to begin with. And if we didn't have a capitalist system, this plan would never have been necessary. So this plan is only reifying the fact that we need to help people below the poverty line. So those are the sorts of impacts you would want to go for. Impacts like this are really useful because they allow you to leverage it in specific relation to outweighing their case. Impacts like this, value to life or expendable, are also good for leveraging against impacts of case because they make the impacts of case irrelevant. Because case no longer meets a value to life standard. And so if you're winning your value to life standard, it doesn't matter how many people they're saving with their plan, because their plan justifies that people below a certain line were still expendable to begin with. Even if their plan doesn't explicitly do that, because capitalism does, their plan is still liable. So the next part would be your alternative. Can anyone think of an example of an alternative in this case?
Make all healthcare free.
Sure. Cool. United States federal government will make all healthcare free, gives you access into having a true value to life, absent commodification. Be careful with it because you are kind of just extending a subsidization of healthcare. Careful to characterize it differently. But yeah, can you give me an example that is a reject style alternative? Think of one.
Voting neg will reject all forms of capitalism.
Cool. You might also want to make it specific to this round, especially if you're going to go post fiat, then you need to make it something that's not just vote neg to reject this in all of its instances, because you have to reject it in the specific instance of this fiat world. So vote neg or the USFG will reject the commodification of healthcare. And then you could even do it, the United States federal government will reject the commodification of healthcare by making all healthcare free, or something like that. Cool, I like it. If you wanted to have a larger capitalist alternative that wasn't specifically related to healthcare, you could also transition from capitalism entirely. Having something like this can be problematic because you're still bound into the fact that the United States is a capitalist entity. So having an alternative that ignores the healthcare problem entirely and goes outside of it, such as the USFG shall transition into a system of bioregionalism. Allows you to say bioregionalism deconstructs capitalism, and therefore this world no longer has any of these problems. Whereas having an alternative like this still binds you into other forms of capitalism that would exist. Cool. Any questions on this example? Okay, let's do one other one quickly.
I have a quick question about the alternatives.
Yeah.
Is it usually a United States federal government action?
A post-fiat alternative will often take the same actor that the plan did. They'll just do something else. It doesn't necessarily have to, but it's often easiest to do it that way. So you can also, DDEV is a really good post-fiat way of going about capitalism if you want a real transition, where you say the United States federal government will essentially do something that deliberately collapses the economy. It doesn't have to be the same actor, it often is. Let's do natives/First Peoples. Okay, plan, the USFG will model example. So the United States federal government will fully enfranchise Native Americans. Or in theory, they could say Indians, but no one would actually do that at this point. Okay, so does anyone know the thesis of a natives First Peoples criticism? Roughly? Why would you not say the United States federal government will fully enfranchise Indians? Just as a general
It's
thing.
ontology thing, you're, by the way you recognize them as disenfranchising them.
Yeah, exactly. So it's offensive, right? It's not a term that those communities want to have. It is one that was given to them by the state, and it's one that is oppressive to be used. That's why it's an offensive term, and that's why people just in general speech don't use it. The same thing can be said about the term Native Americans, and a lot of people have argued that it should be replaced with First Peoples. So this would be an example of a discursive criticism. So thesis, First Peoples are systematically oppressed by the state through silencing, okay, so First Peoples are systematically oppressed by the state through silencing, such as failing to use the names that they wish to be called by, and restrictions on access to basic rights, would be the gist of that thesis. The framework for this criticism is going to be pre-fiat or post-fiat. Pre-fiat. Why is it pre-fiat? It's a problem that exists in the status quo. Anything else?
It's also in the language of their plan text.
Yeah, exactly. Because problem is discursive. So this is where you would make an argument such as fiat is illusory. You aren't actually doing plan, the words you use are actually happening and therefore are more important. Which would make us want to say that the impacts of decay happened before the plan. And are literally real world. And then of course you're still going to make your methodology before ontology arguments. Okay. What are some links between the thesis of the criticism and the plain text? Pretty basic one.
Right. They use the term Native American.
Yeah. And you see links like this all the time where they're like, you use X term. Yeah.
I feel really stupid for asking this, but why is the term Native American like wrong?
Yeah, so That is its own very large debate, but the crux of the reason is essentially every group should have the empowerment and right to be called whatever they want, and it should never be decided for them. The reason it's offensive for us to call them Indians is because we came here and thought it was India, therefore decided to call them Indians. But Native Americans is also a term we gave them. These weren't the Americas until we started calling it that, right? Even First Peoples is a pretty debatable term. It seems maybe more reasonable because it's not tying them to a nationality that they don't identify with, but it's still
ties them to a timeline before we got here.
it ties them to a timeline, and it also bunches them into a single group.
Right.
There are tons and tons of different cultures of First Peoples, and they would absolutely and in no way identify themselves as the same society, and to lump them together is not reasonable. It's actually one of the most effective answers to a native's criticism, is to be like, actually permutation, list every single Native American tribe that is in question, and be like, you would have had to do that if you actually wanted to fully hear their voice, or something like that. But, yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. Oh, cool. Okay, so you use the term Native Americans. Impacts to this criticism would be something along the line of an extension of why it's bad for you to be systematically oppressed, specifically for you to be systematically silenced. So you would want to go for silencing is bad, probably because it leads to otherization / all violence. It's marginalizing. And then you have your basic, like, actually this just creates poverty sorts of impacts. And extending those ones out will give you pretty much all the leverage you would need. The alternative to a discursive criticism like this is also pretty simple. In general, you would just reread the plan, but interject First Peoples instead of the term Native Americans. So, okay, so that's 10. That's an example of a discursive criticism.